feel like I'm all by myself today. Does anybody have anything for the prayer list? I guess that's good. I can hear myself pretty loudly, so.
Hey Matt, the Harbins and Travis's dad.
Yeah.
Steve's brother, Doug, has COVID pneumonia. He's in the hospital.
Did you say Doug? His name is Doug? Anybody else? Okay, let's pray and then we'll get started in Corinthians. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we're thankful for the safety of the night, the rest that we've received. Thankful that we can be here today. Thank you for this place and the people that worship here, and we ask that you continue to watch over us and bless us in our efforts to serve you. Thank you for the Bible. Thank you that we have it, that you've blessed us with it, that we can know what you would have us to do, the way that we should live, the way that we should treat people. Please help us to study it so that we can know your ways. Please help us to apply it to our lives and be better people each and every day. Thank you for all the ways that you bless us. We look around and we see so many things that you do for us. We know that it comes from you, and we're honored that you care for us. Please be with some that we have on our hearts and minds. Please be with the Harbin family and in their loss, and Travis's dad. Please comfort him and their family, and be with them during this time. Please be with Steve's brother Doug in his illness, and please help him to recover and regain his health. Please be with all those who are sick, and please be with the doctors and nurses as they continue to provide care for those patients. Please be with us as we continue to try to serve you. Please forgive us when we don't do what's right. Please help us to always turn back to you. Please help us all to make it to heaven someday. In Jesus' name, amen. I believe we're in verse 6, if I remember right. I should have marked it down and I didn't. I always do that for some reason. Get to mark it down. Might as well just go back to the first chapter, I guess. We've been talking about marital relationships, and they had sent word to Paul, and they were asking questions, and so he's been answering those in the first, or in this whole chapter actually. The first one that he's going to answer is some people were saying it was not good. That was verse 1 for a man to have sexual relations with a woman in the married relationship, and he answered them that that's not the case. Just because sexual immorality is wrong doesn't mean that relationship is wrong in a marriage situation. That they should not deprive one another because it could lead to temptation and to sin within that marriage that could cause that marriage to break up or to hurt one or both people within that marriage. And in verse 6 he says, "Now as a concession, not a command, I say this." And so that is, you see this several times in chapter 7 where he says that this is kind of his opinion. He's giving advice as a godly individual. In another verse he says because he is trustworthy, that people should listen. It's not something that he's just come up with on his own and without thinking about this. In verse 7 he says that I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. And so he's continuing to talk about how each one should live, and if you can, to live on your own and to live as he lived. Most of the reason that he wants people to do this, he continues it in verse 8. And he says to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. He wants people to be devoted to God. That be their first and most important driving force in their life. To serve God and to do what he says. And he continues in chapter 7 by saying, and he says, look, the things that are going on right now within the church, and then the pressures from outside of the church on the church, from people in Corinth and the world, there are going to be distractions if you're married. There's going to be pressures on you if you're married. Things that could lead you from the most important relationship that you have, and that's with Christ. And that should be our number one focus, even in our marriages. That God is number one in our life, and that's what he's saying here. And his advice to them is, if they can, to stay unmarried so that they can continue that. In verse 9 it says, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So he's saying to them, more important than anyone's external status is the importance of their relationship with God. But if you can't practice self-control, then it's better for you to get married. Now, what would their passion and their burning with passion most likely lead them to do? And that's why Paul is saying that to them. If you can't control your impulses, then get married. It's better to do that than to visit temples and things that we've been talking about, to seek out those things that people in those communities and in that world did on a pretty constant basis. I would imagine. Very very prevalent. We've talked about that. Very easy access to things of that nature. And so he's saying, if you just can't control that, then it's better for you to get married. And he talks about self-control. We know about that. It's one of the fruits of the Spirit. It's also one of the Christian virtues that's listed in 2 Peter. It is absolutely important that we have self-control, that we don't just give in to everything that we think of or that we want to do. And that, what is that a part of? That Paul has been trying to convince them to move in this direction. It's maturity. That is part of maturity. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions about this part? Or are y'all waiting to talk about the next step? Been waiting all week. Me too. I've been laying awake at night thinking about it. I really have. This serious stuff, it's in the church is controversial. It really is. I've been on both sides of it, and good gracious, it can really divide people pretty quickly. Anyway, we'll go on if there's nothing about that section. Okay, verse 10. It says, "To the married I give this charge, not I but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife." That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Not much controversy there. And the implication here is that he is talking to a Christian couple, to people within the church at Corinth that have both given their lives to Christ, that have put on Christ, that are within that church. What is the teaching? You get married, you stay married. There's no other option for you. That's what he says. You should not separate from your husband. Now, he does say, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. So what's the option that you have? You can leave. You can separate. You shouldn't. That's how important it is. But if you do, you have to remain unmarried, or you have to reconcile with your husband or your wife. That's the rule for Christian married couples. Any questions on that one? That one's pretty easy. You got through that one pretty simply, right? People don't argue about that one, right? You know, in the study of this, and I've talked to Megan a lot about this. You know what's really important, and this is what we need to keep in mind. I believe it's how serious marriage is. You know, a lot of people look for these what ifs. We want to play what if. Well, what if this happens, Matt? Well, what if that happens? Well, what about this situation? I can think of something. Well, what about that? God is trying to tell us how important marriage is and who you marry and how important that is. Because the intention from God from the very beginning is what? We all know that, right? What is that? One man, one woman, one lifetime. That's the plan from the beginning. And so that's what Christ taught. That's what he says. This is not my teaching. This is from Jesus while he was here. This is what Jesus taught. And that's what you have to do. And that's the real easy part. And I think we understand that, and I don't think there's any controversy on that point. Now you can play the what if game a lot. People have come up with all sorts of reasons and excuses to get divorced and then to remarry, and that's where you get into a lot of controversy with people. If you look at divorce in general, it says God hates divorce, and God hates divorce. That is very, very clear in the Old Testament. You look at Malachi chapter 2. It says that. Now, why does he hate divorce? And I think this is important too. What does divorce do to people and to families and to society and to kids and to husbands and wives? What does it do? It destroys, it decimates. It decimates those individuals. It destroys those kids. It destroys the family. It destroys even our own culture. You've seen our world and how many divorces people go through, and it destroys people. That's why God hates divorce, because it destroys. And so I want you to know. I want you to know that I take this very seriously. My own marriage and then marriage in general. And I think if I don't think I know this. If you go into marriage with the idea that one day I don't like this, I'll just get out of it. Man, that's the wrong attitude to have. Especially with Christians, as we get into those marriage bonds and those promises that we make to one another. And the thing that I've really gotten out of this is we have to make it extremely important for our kids that they understand how serious it is when you enter into that marriage relationship and who you marry. It is incredibly important when we marry who we marry. Are there any thoughts on that?
Well, Pat thinks it says somewhere here that Pat can live with Larry for 56 years. Anybody can do it. So she's just sure that it says that somewhere.
I'm sure it's pretty easy to live with you, Larry. Is Matt Bassing on that list too?
Oh yeah,
Maybe a lot of us.
First Megan 6 and verse 1.
Yeah. Okay.
Jeremy, one of the things that you stated there that divorce destroys.
I'm Matt, but that's okay.
That is true based upon Christian families.
Yeah.
You get into situations where divorce is a saving factor in your family. Bad situations.
There are dangerous situations, and I know what you're talking about. And it can protect people, and I understand that. But it still hurts.
Yes, and it's not as God designed it.
No.
And then you get into the remarriage part is where you get into
Right.
with it all.
Absolutely. You get into controversy with what about people who are not in the church, and what do you do about marriage divorce and remarriage? What do you do about those two things? That's what we're going to get into right now. What about unbelieving spouses? That's what he's going to talk about next. So, obviously, what group is in the church at Corinth? You've got people that are married. One spouse is believing, and one spouse is not. And so they have asked him this question: what about those marriages? I think the first question is probably, should we leave them? Should we leave those people? Should we divorce them because they're not following Christ? We've converted and they're not going to. So should we leave them? And this is what he says. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord. And what I believe he's implying there is that Christ did not address the responsibility of a Christian and an unbeliever in the marriage bond while he was here. He did not teach on that. Or at least not that it's recorded. I guess it's not, because Paul says it's not. He says, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. So, what's the rule if they're willing to stay with you? Paul, what if we have a spouse who's unbelieving? Should we divorce that person and leave? And live as a Christian person and let them live outside the church? Should we divorce them or not? What does he say? No, you should not. You should stay with them. The rules in that situation are the same as as if those two married people were both Christian people. If they're willing to stay with you, then you stay with them. Now, why? He says that in verse 16. Why should you stay with your spouse, even if they're unbelieving, if they consent to stay with you? What's the reasoning behind that? Yes, you don't know if one day your life and your influence and your example may influence them to become a Christian. So if they're willing, and I'm sure we could come, man, I guarantee you we could come up with some examples of that just right off the bat, where people stayed with people, women and men, and helped their spouse become a Christian. I know too in my own family. One of them was my granddad, and the other one is my father-in-law. He's a Christian today because of his wife. And so even in my own family, that influence has taken place, that example where people were willing to stay with their spouse, even though they had converted and their spouse had not, led to people becoming really, really strong Christian people in the church. So that's the reason for it. So, like I said, if they're willing, you stay. If they stay, you stay. Now, here we go. Here's where we get into stuff that people really, really disagree on. Okay, so it says, for the unbelieving, this is not it. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So what he's saying there is the intimacy between an unbeliever and a believing spouse is sanctified by the Christian partner's relationship with God. That's what he's saying there. God blesses and approves relationships between Christians and non-believers for the sake of the believer. Now, what about the kids? It says that if otherwise your children would be unclean. Now, what does that mean? Some people say, children are born with sins of their father. That is not what Paul is saying here. He is saying that children are holy because of the believing parent and the way that parent is an example to them, that they teach them the ways of God. They are a force for godly living for the unbelieving spouse and the children. And the kids, if they did not have them around, they would not have that influence. They would not benefit from that relationship with that believing parent. And so they might not give their life over to God because they would not have that guidance and that influence that believing parent would give them. That's what he's saying there. So, by staying, you help your kids, you help your spouse. Hopefully your influence will lead them to commit their lives to God and become a Christian so that they too can go to heaven. Because what should you want as their spouse? Right? Don't you want them to go to heaven? I would think you would. Something's wrong if you don't. I mean, if you don't want everyone who's lost to go to heaven, to convert and to become a Christian and to go to heaven, you may need to do some soul searching. That's one of our goals, is to help the lost come to Christ and to be able to spend an eternity with God in heaven. Okay, 15. Here we go. The part that we've all here today for. Let's see Matt squirm. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. Okay. Now, here's how I'm going to give you two possibilities. If you want to know what I think, I'll tell you privately if you want to. If you want me to. I do have an opinion, and I'll keep that to myself. And I'll give you the possibilities. Okay? And then I'll leave it to you. Because I really think that we should study this stuff. I think it's important. If it is something that we should teach and it's truth, I think we should do that. I think if we find out that and I'll give you the possibilities. One is that word enslaved. That's the key part right there for people. What does that mean? Also, some translations, some of you may have bound. That word bound. Now, for Christian people and for people in general with marriage, that bound is a really, really important word. Because what it means is you're bound to that person until you die. And you can look at verse 39. It's the same word. It's the very same Greek word. Talk to my dad about that one. Same Greek word. We all know what that means. Okay? Now, what he's saying is if the unbelieving partner leaves them, let them go. Let it be so. In such cases, you are not bound. You're not enslaved. God's called you to peace. Here's the possibilities. This is one that I looked at yesterday. People believe that you are not held to a social expectation, that you should do everything within your power to reconcile the marriage. So you don't have the social responsibility or the pressure from the church to go and chase those people down. Devoting your energies to going after and to pleasing an unbelieving mate who refuses to live with you is not the way of peace. There's one possibility. Okay? So that eliminates your role to chase those people down, I guess to cause scenes, trying to get them to come back to you in whatever activities they're involved in, that you want them to reconcile with you and come back. Okay? Could that cause controversy if you were involved in those kinds of activities? Could that kill peace? I suppose so. Okay? Here's the other possibility. This is the one that gets pretty crazy and controversial for people. One of the possibilities is that Paul is saying to the abandoned spouse, you are no longer bound. You are no longer bound to that person. That it dissolves that marriage. And when that happens, those bonds are broken, and that individual is free to remarry. That is one of the possibilities, if they choose to, without committing adultery. Now, that's what you've got to study. And that's what you're going to have to decide. Which of those two possibilities? What does that word mean? What does enslaved mean? What does not bound mean? And that's where it gets really difficult, I think, because Paul's not dealing with people that are in the church, and we know that. I mean, people that are outside of the church, man, we really mess our lives up. There's a lot of things that go on outside the church that really, really mess up. And I've been around both. I've been around people that said that means that they're free, and I've been around people who have said basically that if you divorce and get remarried, that even if you are baptized, then you have to divorce that person and you have to live alone, and you can't remarry, or you're living in adultery. So you divorce that person, maybe you have kids or things like that, and you leave that family because that's wrong. I've even seen people withhold teaching people until they do that kind of stuff. That's extreme in my mind, to do something like that. But I'm gonna go with Philippians 2:12. You work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. I think that's important too. I think it is important to study. I will put it that way. I think it is important to study, and I think it is important to go with God, with what God says. And if it says to bind, then we have to bind that on people. If it doesn't, then we cannot. And I'll leave it at that. Doug, go ahead.
Well, I'm not afraid to say that I think that they're free. It says that. It's a lot easier for me who's in a happy relationship to look at an unhappy relationship and say, well, you need to live by my happy relationship standards. That's not peace, and it's not beneficial to them.
Right.
But to be honest, a lot of times when a person leaves, there's reasons for that.
Right.
It's not just because I don't like what you believe. I've found somebody else. And to be honest, if that is given time, that person's going to run off with somebody else anyway, and then you fall into they've committed adultery on you, and you're free enough anyway.
Right.
So,
See, and then you start getting into the what ifs. Like, is that person? See, this is where it gets really crazy. Did you, Doug, wait on purpose for Andrea to find someone else?
Excuse me?
That's where you get into that kind of stuff. Well, what if Doug? What if Doug was planning and planning?
it's not that you need to, but like I said to me,
I know, but some people would do that.
oh, I know, and we've heard that, and
Yeah.
and there'll be people who disagree.
That's a
with
big
me,
what if.
But there comes, and we look at sin. You can be forgiven for murder. You can be forgiven for thievery. Don't commit adultery, or you'll never forgive them of that.
Divorce.
It's a sin that God allows for forgiveness.
Right. That's what my dad said.
I can't go and resurrect somebody that I've murdered.
Right.
So there comes to me. I'm not afraid to say what I think. I think that you literally are freed up to look again.
I think it's important to look at what they would understand that word to mean.
But I think there's rules for that even. You need to find a Christian mate next time.
Right.
Don't go keep finding unfaithful people. That doesn't work either. You know, if your believing spouse or unbelieving spouse leaves you and says, I'm leaving you because you're a Christian, why, I'm of the opinion, why would God hold you to an unreasonable, because they're off living their life happy, and why would you have to live the rest of your life unhappy?
That's what you'd be saying. You must live the rest of your life.
And that's not peace. And you're
Right.
still bound
Right.
by somebody that's not really.
What if they burn with passion? What if they had that weakness?
Yeah.
That's another question.
Like I said, it's a touchy subject.
It
Like
is.
I said, it's one of those. It's all well and good for me, who's in a happy relationship, to hold you, who's in an unhappy relationship, to my standards. And
Right.
God understands.
Outside of the church too, by the way.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
To me, so that's. I'm not afraid to say what I think, but but I'm not.
I'm gonna fire you from Wednesday night, Doug.
But I think we are. I think you're right. There are people that hold it, and it's a very touchy subject.
They are the stuff that I looked at about the first possibility that I talked about. Man, they're dead serious. They are hardliners with that belief.
Right.
That they are absolutely not free from that marriage. That's not what that means.
This is a specific instance he's talking about.
It is.
An unbeliever
It is.
being a believer because of their belief.
It is.
And I think too often the world takes this and applies it to every relationship.
Yeah.
You take two Christian people, and we have
Oh, yeah.
Before this, it's very black and white.
Yeah.
But I think too often in the church, we take this instance and apply it to every marriage or divorce.
Some people would. The difficulty for me is, what do you do? And this is a real situation. It's a real situation. Paul's not playing what ifs. Paul is speaking to people that are worried about this stuff. Like, what do we do with people whose spouses have abandoned them? You know, what do they do? Yes. An unbelieving spouse. And you know, you understand what's going on. In this society, what most likely happened is during these times of festivals and these times of worship at these temples, that Christian spouse said, I can't do that with you anymore. I can't go to those places. I can't participate in those activities. And that unbelieving spouse, what seems like what happened is they said, well, I will find someone who will. And they left. And they wanted to live in that lifestyle. I'm perfectly happy with the lifestyle that I'm leading. I don't want your Christianity. I'm out. And I'm leaving. And you do what you want to do. But to them, that's the situation that they find themselves in. I don't know how many people it is. It was significant enough that they wrote to Paul about it. So I guess it either is really, really serious to them or it bothered them to the point where let's ask Paul, an apostle, about what to do in this situation.
Well, I think, to be honest, this is where we as Christian parents and Christian or your grandparents, the importance really, like I said, we have an early Christian church where you have people who are converting. But if you have a child who is growing up in the church, it behooves us to teach them you're going to have a lot better time in life if you find a Christian spouse. We don't really go back to that.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that you can't marry an unbeliever and convert them, and it's not. But
Sure.
But there's a lot of importance in finding somebody who believes like you and
Yes.
is willing to raise children like
A
you.
whole lot easier.
We all know people that marry Christian people that are louses.
Sure.
I have a brother who married somebody who went to Harding with him, and she cheated on him, and it about destroyed him mentally, and he doesn't go to church anymore. It damaged him. But that's not to say you can't find losers in the church.
Right.
But it's important for us as parents to try to educate our children. You're going to hopefully find something better if you look within the family of God.
Yeah.
Because you may not be less likely to run into the situation. So
Yeah.
Let's start at the beginning, not halfway down the race, and you
Right.
could have done better. So there's a lot of things that we as Christians can do for our children, but is what it is.
Do you think verse 15 is the context is specifically two non-Christians and one of them is converted and not a Christian that chooses to marry a non-Christian?
That I don't know.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Two unbelievers, one of them converted, or one of them was already a believer and then married an unbeliever. Yeah.
I thought those situations would be a little bit different because somebody made a conscious decision to put themselves in a position.
That I don't know. That's another one.
There you go. No, we're back.
Throw another monkey wrench over there.
That was an easy one, man. That was the easiest one.
Yeah. Yes.
You're combining two things. One is the breaking of the bond of marriage, and that's what they're specifically talking about, where somebody, and that happened a lot in Corinth, when people were converted.
Right.
To JP's point, but you're breaking of the bond. Are you responsible to stay in that relationship of marriage with that person? And he says, no, don't go after them.
Right.
Then you're free from that bond, but you're implying, now what are you free to do?
Correct.
Remarriage, and it brought up earlier, remarriage is the big kicker where you start getting all the what ifs.
Right. Does free mean free to remarry?
You're free
Yeah.
from that bond,
Right.
but are you free to enter into another bond?
Right. And in every other instance where you're free from the bond, you are free to re-enter another marriage. Paul gives one in 39 with death, but it is, and I called my dad. He took Greek and it is the same word. And I tried to go back and think, what would the Corinthians, what would that mean to them? What would that word mean? Enslaved. If you were a slave and you were no longer enslaved, that means you are free from that relationship to that slave owner. And they would, I would assume that, some of them were slaves. I know they were. They would understand what bound and what unbound meant. And I think that's important to understand as well. Like I said, if you want to know what I think, you can ask me, and I'll tell you. I don't know that that's my place here as a member to do that and to steer a congregation in a direction that I believe is a direction that I've read. I don't have any. I don't have any reservations about teaching what the Bible says or anything like that. But something like this, controversial wise, and people they get really fired up about these things, and I would never ever try to cause a division or to make somebody angry or something like that with something like this. So, like I said, if you want to talk to me about it, I'd be more than happy to sit down with you and talk to you about it. But I'm going to stop there for this week, and we'll pick up there next week with some stuff that's not as controversial.